Who was George Washington? Chapter 9, A Brand New Country. George Washington was living again in his beloved Virginia. He was still the most famous man in America, just as he had been all through the war. A constant stream of visitors arrived at Mount Vernon. Everyone wanted to meet His Excellency. What brought Washington out of retirement? The country was floundering. The government was weak. It didn't have the power to raise taxes or control trades or mark state boundaries. Washington said, "It was as clear to me as the ABC that the new country needed a much stronger system." In 1787, at a convention held in Philadelphia, the Constitution was written. It mapped out the kind of government George Washington hoped for. There would be 3 branches of power: a strong president, a Congress to pass laws, and a Supreme Court to rule on whether the laws were fair. No one branch would have too much power. Even before the first election for president was held, everyone knew George Washington would win. The election system then was different from the way it is now. Electors from the different states were chosen. Each had 2 votes. Everyone voted for Washington, so he became president. John Adams came in second with 34 votes, so he became vice president. George Washington received the news on April 14th, 1789. 2 days later, he set out for the temporary capital, New York City. There, he would take the oath of office. He said there were no words to express how anxious he felt. He was walking on untrodden ground. He meant there was no path for him to follow because no one had ever been president before. George Washington was sworn in on a balcony at Federal Hall. He said, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." Every U.S. president has taken the same oath. No one even knew what to call the president. John Adams suggested His Elective Highness. Others suggested His Mightiness or Majesty. Washington didn't like anything that sounded as if he were king. In the end, he decided Mr. President would do just fine. The job of president is still in many ways what George Washington first made of it. The president is in charge of foreign policy. That means how the United States deals with other countries. The president presents a budget to Congress asking for money to run the government. The president is commander-in-chief of the army. The president chooses a cabinet, people to advise him on important issues. The president also appoints judges, including judges on the Supreme Court who serve for life. When a Supreme Court judge dies, resigns, or retires, a new one is then appointed. When his first 4-year term was over in 1793, Washington was ready to retire. He was in his 60s. His hair had turned white. His teeth hurt worse than ever. Recently, he'd come down with pneumonia. But the country was still so new and frail, Thomas Jefferson and others wanted Washington to stay on another 4 years. The United States would be a little older then and stronger. When the electors cast their votes, again Washington won, and again John Adams came in second. Washington's second term as president was an unhappy one, almost right from the start. There was a short-lived rebellion of farmers. They had rose up because they didn't want to pay certain taxes on corn. Washington also agreed to a new treaty with the British. It made him very unpopular, but he wanted to avoid another war with the British while the country was still going through growing pains. One newspaper went so far as to call Washington a fake patriot, a hypocrite. The personal insults hurt him greatly. The only part of his job that Washington took pleasure in was planning the new Capitol. There first had been a Capitol in New York, then in Philadelphia. This one would be permanent. Not far from Mount Vernon, it was called Washington City. He saw to the building of the new president's house. Sadly, he is the only president who never got to live in the White House. By the time his second term as president was nearly over, Washington was bound and determined to leave government. He wrote a farewell address, printed in newspapers across the country. He thought 2 terms was long enough to serve as president. It was important to hand over power to the next president. That's what happens in a republic. King George III had once said that if Washington chose to give up power, he'd be the greatest man on earth. That's exactly what he did. For the third and last time, he retired. Sadly, he didn't enjoy the peace of Mount Vernon for very long. December 12th, 1799, was a cold, rainy day. As usual, Washington came home after many hours of farm work. He didn't bother to change his wet clothes before dinner. 2 days later, he developed a bad throat infection. "I find myself going," he whispered to Martha. Then, after taking his own pulse, George Washington died. He was 67 years old. Martha insisted on a simple funeral and burial at Mount Vernon. However, across the country, there were tributes to George Washington. People felt a terrible loss. It almost seemed impossible to think of the young United States without George Washington. Right away, Congress began talking of building a monument to him. No building in Washington, D.C. can be taller than the Washington Monument, which was finished in 1880. And a national holiday in February celebrates George Washington's birthday. The faces carved on Mount Rushmore in South Dakota were the work of Gutzon Borglum and took 14 years to complete. George Washington is so famous that sometimes he seems more like a monument than a flesh and blood man. We think of him as the face on the dollar bills and quarters. Yet, he was as human as anybody. He lived through amazing times and left his mark on our country in a way that no one else has. Perhaps the best tribute came from another signer of the Declaration of Independence, Harry Lee, who praised the memory of the man, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen.